Mr. Rohit Vyas, welcome to ITV Gold. I hope you're doing well today.
Thank you very much. Good to see you all again.
Of course, good to see you too. Let's go right into it, Mr. Vyas, because I have a lot of questions. The president just addressed Pennsylvania and talked about these voting right restrictive laws that we're seeing across many states that are happening. The president said that looking at the voting rights, it's a big lie, which is a big lie, stays as a big lie, and then he said that these voting rights is a test of our time. So my first question to you is, how are you looking at President Joe Biden's address on these voting rights? And following that, Texas Democrats have left the states to go against the voting restrictive laws in the state of Texas. How are you looking at those two things?
Yeah, first of all, addressing this issue is of paramount importance because the so-called big lie continues right now, namely that the presidential election, the last one, which went to Joe Biden, was a hoax, was a fraud, somehow fraudulent in the way it was carried out, and there were the votes were rigged and all the rest of it. All of that is wrong and of course not true, and so, but for some reason, it's that message seems to resonate with a lot of people who believed in Donald Trump, the former president. And it was about time to come out here and say that, look, this was a legitimate election. There was nothing fraudulent about it. There was no big hoax behind it. There were no irregularities of any kind. There wasn't any kind of sabotage of the election results or anything like that. This was a genuine election, a legitimate election that took place with full safeguards in place, as always is the case in Republican and Democratic states alike. So that should be put to rest right away. They needed to address this forcefully a long time ago because there's a large amount of the population, half of the population, that still believes that election was illegitimate. Now, Texas, like other states, has been trying to implement, at least Republican states, Republican governed states, have been trying to put into effect or bring in new legislation to restrict voting in those states. And the idea, it seems, is to target the minority voters, the voters of color, who were the ones who made the difference in this past election, in the 2020 election. And that's what they're trying to do. And what the Democrats in Texas wanted to do, you see, the governor there has called for a 30-day special session and a concurrent series of special sessions to deal with this particular issue. And in order to stall the debate on it and therefore not have a vote by August 7th, which is the deadline for the first 30-day run, the Democrats decided to flee the state. And they're all up in Washington, D.C. today. They addressed the media. They met with Democratic legislators on Capitol Hill to talk about bringing up some kind of measure in the Senate and having that passed, which is not going to happen. All right. That type of measure they're talking about is to safeguard the right of Americans to vote, all Americans to vote. You need a 60 to 40 majority. That will not happen because right now the Senate is split 50-50. And Joe Manchin, the conservative from West Virginia, the conservative Democrat, it could go either way in any case. So that's not going to work. So their idea was to stall the process in Texas. The Texas governor, meanwhile, has threatened arrest. He will arrest those legislators. What I've heard, the latest was that he will have them arrested as soon as they return. So whether they return in the next few days or not, otherwise they have to stay camped in Washington, D.C. till the 7th of August and then return to their home state, Texas. And he has threatened to place them all under arrest. How this will play out legally, I'm not yet certain. The governor says he has the executive authority to do so, to order the arrests of these legislators who he calls errant and delinquent in their duty to the state. But legally, whether that will stand up to challenges, we'll see.
Do you think this is just a little stalling before they still pass these restrictive laws?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that the Republicans want to pass these measures, stringent measures to restrict voting rights. The Democrats are fighting it tooth and nail. And this is a battle we're going to see going on pretty much until the midterm elections next year, 2022. And incidentally, the midterm polls coming up in 2022 will be very, very interesting, very critical, because you're going to see, I've seen some predictions that there could be a red wave, which means Republicans gaining a foothold in Congress which is something the Democrats do not absolutely want to see right now.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about these Republican states or Republican-led states or red states, whatever we want to call them. There is a huge issue again about vaccinations, and many of these states continue to see low vaccination rates. So when the CPAC happened recently, many cheered on the fact that their regions that were red regions did not get vaccination, and they were cheering about it. There were a lot of public there and they were happy about it. Now my question to you is, this is clearly a political issue where certain leaders are not promoting the vaccine whereas the others are. How do we go around this? And what is going to be the result of all of this?
Well, the Arizona governor has been actually pushing for those who have not got vaccinated in his state to go ahead and do so, that it's important, and he has not been keeping quiet. He's been talking about it, pretty, loudly and vocally. The other states, they're just leaving it, people like, states like Florida, Texas, they're just leaving it to their populations. That, of course, is a political game. And on the other hand, it may not be a political game. It may be just to let their people decide in their own free will and their own free fashion as to whether they want to get vaccinated or not. It is, however, extremely important. We're hearing all the scientific data coming out right now. The scientists are speaking up, namely Dr. Anthony Fauci, Scott Gottlieb, and other authorities, people who know this subject well, the infection that is spreading currently during this pandemic, the Delta virus that we are now experiencing. It is obviously spreading among the unvaccinated populations throughout the country, especially in those states, the red states, where a good deal of the population have not been vaccinated. So you have the evidence, it's clear. It's also striking a lot of young people, a lot of them getting hospitalized, a lot of them suffering death, suffering serious disabilities, long-term disabilities, and all the rest of it. The evidence speaks for itself, and it's not a question of why should I get vaccinated. You'd have to be pretty stupid not to see the data, not to see the evidence coming out. It's playing out all over the media, and if you don't see it, then there's something wrong with you. The fact is, at least a couple of the vaccines that are out there and approved so far for emergency use authorization are effective, and it's better to be safe than sorry.
A quick follow-up. What is the political gain from making vaccines or even masks a political issue?
Because I guess it's a matter of freedom of choice. Don't forget, we've been in this pandemic 15, 16 plus months now.
Right.
People are fed up. And I think politicians begin to sense as we come up, that's what I mentioned, the midterm polls coming up. Politicians begin to sense that they better start playing with the population's popular belief. And that's when you start seeing this, especially with gubernatorial races, congressional races, maybe some local races that will take place in 2022. It's a natural tendency for politicians to begin to start studying what's happening within their populations and to start to play within the popular thinking so that they don't lose their seat of government. In this case, governors don't get ousted, or congressional leaders don't get ousted either and have somebody else replace them. So I think it's a very natural tendency, but it's also a lot to do with people being fed up, just plain fed up. And I think also scientists are not very definitive about what's happening. Now you're seeing this play out in Europe as well, in London, in Asia, the Tokyo Olympics. They said initially they said there'd be no spectators at all. This was last year. Then they said there'll be limited spectators. Now that the Delta variant is spreading rapidly, they said there are going to be no spectators for the Olympics, which are beginning shortly, getting underway over there. And you're going to have a month long of sports without any spectators, international sports. Not a pleasant sight. And we don't even know how the players are going to be affected by it, because psychologically players are geared to play to a huge, huge audience during the Olympics and things like that. So I think to answer your question on the political front, this is just going to play out depending on the popular mandate, which means if people say, hey, listen, we're fed up, don't tell us what to do, I don't think any governor in their right thinking is going to want to play with that. So this is why. Plus, there is, as I said, no accurate scientific evidence right now whether masks are needed, not needed, etc., etc. Schools have got to reopen. Everybody knows that by September. The kids are otherwise going to be severely adversely affected. And so there's a lot at play here. And I don't think we're going to see any coherence unless there is a major fallout from this Delta variant or a new one evolving in the future
Right.
that causes another forced lockdown. I don't see anything changing right now.
Politics and science going hand in hand. Only time will tell what's going to happen. Another big issue that's concerning the United States and the world right now is, again, the issue of the troops, the US troops being withdrawn from Afghanistan. Now we're hearing news about violence in Afghanistan. Taliban is being linked to it, and meanwhile, the US troops are being continued to be sent back. How are you looking at the situation? And if the US fully leaves, Afghanistan, do you see a civil war happen there?
I'm not so sure there'll be a civil war. That might be further down the road, but the Taliban are definitely making inroads, very heavy inroads. If the government in Kabul collapses, which is very possible, then we're going to have complete archaic rule under the Taliban, which means women wearing full veils and burqas and all the rest of it. So there's going to be a pretty difficult situation to deal with in Afghanistan. The biggest danger is to see if Al Qaeda gets his footing again, once again, in Afghanistan. If they regain their foothold in that country, if they do, that poses a security and terror threat to the rest of the free world. And that's, of course, the U.S. getting involved in Afghanistan was precipitated by September 11th, 2001. And that was the reason for what happened over there in, the U.S. involvement in the first place in Afghanistan. And so the point is you don't want to see a recurrence of that. But yes, Afghanistan's going to be, unfortunately, having to deal with this on its own. Civil war in terms of depending on who can take on the Taliban by themselves. We'll see what happens if someone can take on the Taliban by themselves. If that happens, then you will see a confrontation, as used to happen once the Soviets had to withdraw or were forced to withdraw. So this is going to be a thing to watch. But it's a dangerous situation, a volatile situation. And right now, no one wants to see the current governor headed by Abdul Ghani, government of Afghanistan headed by Abdul Ghani to fall.
Does this put countries like India, Pakistan, and other neighboring countries or close countries to Afghanistan at risk?
Yes. Well, not at risk, not a direct risk. Pakistan definitely at risk. Tajikistan and other countries to the northeast of Afghanistan, yes, there can be risk of spillover somehow over there. India, in the end, would have to watch its own territories. Obviously, India has had a lot of terrorism emanating from Pakistan. And so if the terrorists in Afghanistan, who are extremely dangerous, decide to cross over into Pakistan and Pakistan does not have the wherewithal to stop them, that could then be some kind of a threat to India in the future. So India, I'm sure Indian armed forces would be extremely vigilant. They're always vigilant on the border with Pakistan. They're always vigilant on the border with China because those are two danger zones for India. But India has dealt with it for years and is pretty, I think, well versed in knowing what to do should there be any threat emanating from Pakistan through the Afghan terrorists that might try to permeate that soil.
So it seems like everybody is kind of on their own. President Biden said on this that he does not want another generation to be at war.
Correct.
He
And
does
that's
not
what Trump
want.
said. Trump said the same thing. Donald Trump, his predecessor, was the one who first initiated the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And President Biden is continuing that policy and speeding it up, as a matter of fact.
Do you agree with it, personally, as a political commentator?
I think at some point you have to withdraw. The thing is to not leave it in tatters, but then who knows how long you'd have to stay there to keep it from disintegrating into tatters, basically. This was a region that really no country has ever been able to do anything about or fix, so-called, if they had to. The Soviets were there for the longest time. They had to leave. They were forced to leave. The United States is forced to leave now. Its allies, the same thing. Everybody had to leave. And for centuries, if you study the history of that region, because of the horrific terrain, now we don't mean horrific terrain, but mountainous, difficult terrain is the right word to use. It's impossible to really try and contain anything. Those who are able to run that country, those who are able to survive in that country are the tribals themselves who live in the area. And really the future of that area will be determined by the tribals who've inhabited the area for centuries.
Right. Let's now talk about Cuba and what's happening there. Could you explain to our viewers what the protest is all about, and also how much of a role is United States playing in this? Because there's a lot of accusation coming back on the country, and I'd like to know what exactly you think about that.
Well, yeah, the accusations will obviously come because the United States announced, tougher sanctions on Cuba because the communists are not letting things be free. They are not allowing a free economy to prosper. In fact, there's a lot of corruption within the communists, and that's been the problem with communism around the world. And President Trump had tightened sanctions. President Biden has tightened sanctions. And the idea was to tighten economic sanctions. Okay? Now, economic sanctions are intended to choke off any funding for the authoritarian regime. Okay? It can also permeate down to the level of people not being able to get supplies, et cetera, et cetera. But that is not the intention of tough economic sanctions, whether it's here or in Iran or wherever else, the hotspots of the world. And so naturally, a regime that is about, now what's happened, of course, in Cuba is all of a sudden there's a popular revolt. The revolt is that you guys can't run the country anymore. It's time for you to get out, bow out, leave, and let the will of the people reign. And that's what's happening there. It's basically a cry for democracy, and it's about time. It's been many, many decades that Cuba has been under this authoritarian, militaristic, communist rule. And the time has come for the people to say, look, we want our freedom. And there's a lot of Cubans who are down there, for instance, in Miami, in the Florida region, et cetera, who are rooting for their brethren over there and hoping that somehow there will be freedom. It's a very volatile situation. Again, the United States will at some point be asked for help from the citizens who are fighting this movement. It is a totally domestic issue, where citizens now are feeling that they don't have enough food, they don't have enough prosperity, they're unable to get things done in their lives, and this government ought to go. And the United States supports that. So do many other freedom-loving nations around the world. They support that. They want freedom in Cuba, and Cuba's a beautiful country, by the way. And once it's able to break free of this tight grip of authoritarianism, you're going to see a whole change in Cuba, and hopefully that'll happen.
So many countries fighting for their freedom. I think we should all really appreciate the freedoms we have in this country. My last question to you actually has to deal with New York City. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams has been nominated as the Democratic candidate for New York City Mayor. The elections are in November. How are you looking at that? He is a former cop. He is the Brooklyn Borough President. He has a lot of insight into safety, public safety, and reducing the crime rate in New York City. What do you have to say about him?
Very interesting. He's also a very popular person among a diverse population in New York City. There are many South Asians, for instance, who've supported his run and have found him to be a very amenable person, a very amiable individual, somebody who is open to hearing everything out. It's very interesting you asked me this question today because Curtis Sliwa, the Republican opponent, who is the head and the founder of the Guardian Angels, which dealt with crime years back in the 70s and the 80s in New York City. And, they had this whole team of volunteers who went into the subway system to protect citizens because the police didn't have enough forces out there to be able to deal with that crime situation, crime wave back then. And I was there in New York City and remember that vividly. So now Curtis Sliwa has come out with a challenge to Eric, and he said, look, you are refusing federal funding to add funding to the police force in New York City. You're refusing to accept that money if you are the mayor of New York, if you're elected mayor of New York City. You're refusing to accept that money and bolster the New York City police. Whereas Curtis Sliwa says he will make sure that he collects that money and adds forces to the police force. Right now, New York City has seen a 40 to 45% increase in crime. We have not seen that in this city since, as I mentioned, the 70s and the 80s. That was the last time it happened, and Rudy Giuliani came in and cleaned up the entire city along with his police commissioner at that time, Bill Bratton, if I recall correctly. And they worked really hard to clean up the city and transform Times Square and 42nd Street and all the rest of it from the seedy place that it used to be into this. This is going to be the core issue that's going to decide the election, I think, in New York City. Diversity is one thing to talk about, but many minority populations are suffering, at the hands of criminals in New York City right now. And will that minority population decide to go with Curtis Leva? It's quite possible because Curtis Leva was a people's person. He's somebody I've known. I've studied his background. I've studied Eric Adams' background. Eric Adams, also a person of the people, one who is very conducive to helping those who are in the minority and listening to them, lending them his ear, so to speak. But it's going to come down to the issues of, is New York City safer today than it was yesterday, and are you going to make it safer if you're elected mayor of the city or not? And I think Curtis Leva is going to have a pretty tough edge over Eric Adams, at least for the moment. Okay, Eric Adams, even though he's a former police officer, he's going to have to come out very forcefully to talk about law enforcement and enforcing the law. And if he hesitates, that could be a problem for him, in my opinion. I don't think you're going to see an easy sweep for either candidate. It's going to come down to issues of law enforcement in that city. It's going to come down to things like immigration, whether illegals should be given, the freedoms they have and the facilities they have, et cetera, et cetera. These will determine that election in New York City.
And quite interestingly, this issue of crime is actually one of the top priorities of the Biden administration because of the increase in crime in many big cities. Thank you so much for your time today on ITV Gold.
Thank you. Good to see you all again.
Good to see you too.